If you had somebody in your family who fought in World War II, they probably didn't talk about it very much. That was the case in my family. And Ben Morrow doesn't talk often about the plane crash that he survived over the Pacific. Unless you give him some scotch and, you know. So the stories that we have from our families and from people who fought bravely and managed to end the scourge in Europe and what would have been the rest of the world of the Nazi regime. Those stories are poignant and precious. And so when it came to my attention that Shari Cassutt had an uncle who'd fought in the war and had a really rather remarkable story to tell, I thought, well, that would be perfect for the weekend when we observe Kristallnach. And then, because the story was grand enough, if you will, I don't want to say long enough, but compelling enough to break it into two parts, we're going to have her speak and tell us about the second part of the story in February, before the scribe comes to set sort of a framework for us for the next time we work here on our Holocaust scroll. But Shari's story of her uncle, along with Ambrose Ferber speaking his words, I think will find a place in your hearts tonight, and I certainly hope that it does. Shari?
Is that right? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, everyone, for being patient and listening to us. And thank you, Ambrose. If you haven't had the pleasure of hearing Ambrose read before, you'll know in a few minutes why I asked him to help me with this presentation. Ambrose will be the voice of Uncle Nat and one other, and I'll fill in with the narrative. So, my Uncle Nat Crandall, though at the beginning of this story, his name is Nathan Cohen. He was a nice Jewish boy from Canada, born of Eastern European Orthodox parents, living in New York, working in the garment district when the war broke out. By the end of the war, he was a hero, the recipient of 2 Purple Hearts and 2 Bronze Stars. As a child, I didn't know my Uncle Nat was a hero. The only war story I knew was this. Uncle Nat was out on night patrol with his unit when he spotted something ahead. Someone, standing stock still looking right at them. He waved his men down. Finally, after 20 minutes of lying in the dirt while neither his unit nor the enemy ahead moved, Uncle Nat crawled forward to scope out the situation. He got closer and closer until finally Uncle Nat encountered a telephone pole. There is probably a link between this story and the fact that my Aunt Ruth was the only woman I knew who was the family driver. Aunt Ruth, face it, women didn't drive then, you know? Aunt Ruth Leshney, was the youngest of my father's aunts. She was just a few years older than my father's oldest brother. Nat and Ruth's 4 children straddle both my father's generation and mine. Rick, the oldest of the Crandall kids, is now 70-ish, 10 years younger than my father would be. But Wayne, the youngest, is 2 years younger than I am. Bev and Jerry are somewhere in the middle. As a child, this was all very confusing. We didn't see that much of the Crandalls, especially after we moved to California from Levittown, Long Island, when I was 8. I remember their house on the south shore of Long Island in the town of Merrick, right on the water of South Oyster Bay. I remember that Uncle Nat had a furniture store, porch and patio. I remember the Crandalls visiting us in Palm Springs. I remember my Uncle Nat as a tall, athletic man, which in my family was memorable. However, this is the clearest memory I have of Uncle Nat. Uncle Nat is sitting on a chair in the big room above the bowling alley that he owned in Rockville Center. All the cousins are lined up in front of him, waiting to receive a silver dollar from the cloth bag he holds on his lap, our reward for the return of the Afikoman. I was 5 or 6, and I never saw another Donald Duck cartoon featuring Uncle Scrooge McDuck and his big bags of money without thinking of Uncle Nat and his silver dollars. Rabbi's right. Like most soldiers, Uncle Nat didn't talk much about his experiences in the Army, and certainly not to the kids. But Wayne does remember his father's nightmares and knew for as long as he can remember that they were somehow connected to the war. One evening, when my uncle was in his mid-60s having dinner with Rick, he started talking. He shared his memories of battles, the daily life of a soldier, and for the first time in Rick's memory, his part in the liberation of Dachau. My cousins began taping their father's stories. Uncle Nat was drafted in February of 1943. Aunt Ruth was pregnant with Rick. She went to live with family for the duration. Uncle Nat was assigned to Company A of the 1st Battalion, 180th Infantry Regiment, 45th Division, also known as the Thunderbird Division. The Thunderbirds were a National Guard unit from Oklahoma and became part of the regular Army in 1941. He and other draftees from the Bronx joined the Cowboys and the Cherokees of the 45th. Imagine the culture shock on both sides. Uncle Nat traveled by Liberty convoy to North Africa. The troops slept in modified hammocks stacked 4 high. They slept in 8-hour shifts around the clock. When one sleeping shift was over, the men were sent up on deck to do not much of anything but to get out of the way, allow the next shift to sleep, and to ponder the mysteries of a soldier's life.
We were all puzzled. Why did we have to bring mattress covers with us, 2 apiece? Well, we later learned that they were used for body bags. They just used us as couriers, and they all went to some central place for subsequent use.
Of course, Uncle Nat was worried about his wife and soon-to-be son at home, though as I remember hearing, my pregnant Aunt Ruth was spoiled rotten by the rest of the family. All the best foods were put on her plate, and she and the baby were in no fear of starvation. In fact, quite the opposite.
I don't know how my wife made out during those years. My salary was $60 or $65 a month, and I sent it to Ruth and only held out $3 or $4 per month. I didn't smoke. She did amazingly well with that little money.
Finally, after 21 days on the ship, the 45th landed in Oran, Algeria. They were about to see action for the first time. They were sent to Anzio to join the invasion of Italy.
We were all green as a cucumber. We were all pinned down by German fire. Anzio had this very flat beachhead. You'd walk for an hour and a half on the flat until you'd start to see the rise of the hills. So we were wide open. The British soldiers who were right next to us had to have their tea at 4 o'clock every afternoon. The Germans knew that, so at 4 p.m. every day, the German Spitfires came around to lambast us. There was no place to hide.
The Anzio campaign never accomplished its main objective of breaching the German Gustav line that stretched across the Italian peninsula. However, the battle at Anzio did tie up the German army, allowing other Allied troops to move forward toward Rome. For 4 months, Allied troops were locked in on the beaches of Anzio.
The Germans had a modus operandi to demoralize us, and they did a pretty good job of it. We would each send out patrols out to case each other every night. The land between us was a real no man's land. It was booby-trapped, and it was just a mess. We were bombarding each other, but they had the protection of the hills, and we had no protection. We couldn't break out.
It's hard for me to believe that just months before, my uncle was working in a coat and suit factory, assigning work to subcontractors, purchasing buttons, twill tape, and zippers, and now...
We were running around, just trying to find a safe place. It put the fear of survival in you. You formed a team. Every American soldier carried a dog tag that had your number and your religion. Mine was stamped with Hebrew, so I never wore my dog tag around my neck. I always had it in my back pocket, so if I was captured, I'd just throw it away, because I didn't want them to know I was Jewish.
2,800 Americans died at Anzio. 11,000 American troops were injured, including Uncle Nat. He earned the first of his 2 Purple Hearts.
It was at Capo Leone where I was wounded with shrapnel, and that was an experience. The Germans had tanks all around, and they were launching shells everywhere. A piece of bazooka shrapnel the size of my thumb hit me in the leg, and the force of that impact knocked me down to the ground, and I threw up. I was in a state of shock. I had to get back to the medical station, but a lot of other guys were wounded too, so there was no help. I began to crawl towards the first aid station. I dragged my rifle with me because you're not allowed to be without a gun. There were a lot of German dead bodies all around you, and you had little protection. You kept worrying that maybe one of these guys laying around was still alive and just playing dead, and that's why you needed the gun. I don't know how long I crawled because I was in a bad mental state, but I made it back to the first aid station.
After recovering in a hospital in Naples, Uncle Nat rejoined the Thunderbird Division in southern France. They were mopping up after General Patton's troops and the Battle of the Bulge.
So we marched through France. This is maybe March of 1944. The fighting wasn't too fierce, but there were a number of instances where we made contact with the enemy. The Germans seemed to pull back a bit. They weren't so aggressive in France. But when we got to German soil in the Black Forest, that got really rough. It turned out the effort the Germans made and lost at Bastogne was sort of a last-ditch stand. After that, they started retreating. They were desperate, even dressing their soldiers in American uniforms and infiltrating us. Our command told us that we should test American soldiers we didn't recognize by asking them questions about baseball. We tried to crack the Siegfried line, but we couldn't do it at first. We were told to retreat back. My leg had not completely healed. I was running along the road, and they opened up on us. And as I ran, I kept coming down hard on my leg, and it gave away. I fell, and I rolled over the embankment. As I did, I could see the tracer bullets flying overhead where I had been a second before. Lucky. I was in the right place at the right time.
By April 20th, 1945, the 45th had made its way to Munich, having marched through Nuremberg. They were ordered to liberate Dachau.
In the back of our minds, it wasn't so much that we wanted to liberate Dachau. We wanted, to the man, to get this war over with. Not so much the humanitarian aspects, although that came into it later when we saw with our eyes and smelled with our noses what went on at Dachau. We were just sick and tired of war.
Dachau is 10 miles outside of Munich. It was originally built as the first concentration camp for political prisoners. During the early years, most of the internees were communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and others who opposed the Nazis. After Kristallnach, the number of Jews at Dachau rose significantly. At the time of liberation, approximately 1/3 of the inmates were Jewish. Prisoners at Dachau were forced into slave labor or used for medical experiments. The routines and procedures at the Dachau camp served as a model for later concentration camps, and it served as a training facility for camp guards. On April 29th, elements of the 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions and the 20th Armored Division all converged on Dachau. The day before liberation, the infamous death train arrived from Buchenwald carrying Jews, Slavs, Romas, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Freemasons. The train had left Buchenwald 4 weeks earlier with 5,000 human beings packed into 40 cars. When it arrived at Dachau, 861 had survived. They were living among 2,300 corpses.
I remember where the guardsmen stood as we walked into Dachau. With all the barbed wire and the stanchions all around, I saw the gas chambers, the buildings, the piles of clothes, the goods that were being pilfered by the Germans. There were live prisoners still stumbling around, and when they finally saw the Americans, they knew the war was over. The inmates who were in there were afraid to come out because they were afraid of anyone with a uniform. There was no flesh left between the skin and bones. They had no hair. Their skulls were grotesque. Their teeth were gone. There are no words that can describe the horror. You had to see it.
Uncle Nat and his fellow soldiers were put to work.
As soon as we got into Dachau, we immediately knew what we had to do. There were corpses piled like cordwood all over, uncovered. The stench was horrible, and it was becoming a health hazard. Some of the bodies had been buried, but towards the end, the Germans just didn't care anymore. The first job that we had to do was to put the bodies in the ground without even trying to identify any of them, because the plague had set in from the conditions. Instead of doing it ourselves, we commandeered the Germans. There were still some around. Bulldozers were flown in, and we bulldozed some graves, and the captured Germans pushed the bodies in. It took a good 7 days to get this thing done. The American Army did a good job of getting medical people in and supplies to tend to the freed prisoners.
Decades later, my cousin Wayne visited Dachau to take a walk in his father's footsteps. He told me the ovens were tiny and the barracks were haunting, but his most visceral experience was hearing the crunch of the gravel under his feet, the sound we all know from movies about the war, the sound of Nazi boots marching. I read other accounts of the liberation of Dachau, pored over photos, read letters, and tried to decipher military correspondence, just trying to get an inkling of what my uncle saw and experienced, trying to make sense out of the senseless. One story stood out from the others, a memory recounted by Jack Goldman of Colorado. Jack Goldman was also at Dachau that day, but he wasn't a member of the Liberating Army. Jack Goldman was Dachau prisoner number 69970.
After the Americans arrived, they took our names. For the first time, we were no longer numbers. They asked for our names.
Uncle Nat didn't remain at Dachau very long. Victory in Europe, VE Day, was declared on May 8th. His troops were moved to guard surrendering Germans and Italians and to build facilities to house and feed them. The 45th was sent back to the U.S. for training before being deployed to Japan, but Uncle Nat was done serving his country. He was discharged before the 45th was shipped out again. The colors of the Thunderbirds are displayed at the American Holocaust Memorial Museum, along with those of other units that liberated the camps throughout Europe. Uncle Nat passed away at the age of 86. I have one other memory of Uncle Nat. It involves a car trip from New York to Florida, my Aunt Zelda's dining room table, and a Torah. And that's what I'll be speaking about when the rabbi has me back in February. Thank you. Thanks, Rose.
The Torah, black fire inscribed on white fire, bound in bands of fire. We continue now on page 46 with the Amidah. Please rise as you're able.
Adonai Sefatai Tiftach Ufia Gita Hilatecha Adonai